jump in straight away and ask Jane a question, because there was the question, what is the name of the pink rose in the front of Dove Cottage?
Well, this is going to be really bad because I don't know. So that's
sorry. I was sure you would know. I did. So we'll scrap that bit. So we'll start properly now. Serious expressions. We'll start properly.
I would have known it had I planted it, but as it's been there for a good while and there are thousands of varieties of roses, I haven't a clue.
Well, that must be the first question I've asked that you haven't been able to answer. So I apologise for putting you on the spot. For those who are new, people who don't know me, my name is Jeff Cowton, and I'm the Principal Curator, Head of Learning at Wordsworth Grasmere. Welcome to those who are regulars, and a particular welcome to those if this is your first webinar that you've joined us. The purpose of the webinars, as you can probably gather, is to share knowledge, and that's the knowledge of us people, as it were, on the screen, but also people attending the webinar. So please do share, please do ask questions and tell us your thoughts. I'm sitting in the reading room of the Jerwood Centre, and the Jerwood Centre is our research library, where we have something like 70,000 books, manuscripts, pictures, relating obviously to the period of Wordsworth, around about like 1800, let's say, and the fine art and the travel literature that came out of the discovery of the Lake District by tourists and artists at the time. I'm about 50 yards from Dove Cottage, and if you haven't been to Dove Cottage, you're not so familiar. Dove Cottage in the heart of Grasmere, Grasmere Valley, I should say. It's where William and Dorothy Wordsworth in their late 20s arrived. They came in 1799. They stayed here for about 8 years. It was during this time that William Wordsworth created some of his greatest poetry. His sister Dorothy wrote her now famous Grasmere journals. It was here that William and Mary were married. It's here where 3 children were born. But importantly for tonight, it's here where they developed this unique garden. A garden behind the cottage that was a little domestic slip of mountain. It was something that Wordsworth described as the loveliest spot that man hath ever found. And it was, they said, the work of their own hands, and so therefore something they regarded with pride and partiality. And it's something that obviously we've researched it in the past, but it's had a particular fresh research interest in recent times, prompted by 2 things. One is Jane Roberts joining us as head gardener, and secondly by Jeremy Davies introducing us to a project with Leeds University, which, as we'll see, these 2 things together have had a huge impact on the garden and our understanding and its appearance in recent times. So just to introduce our 2 guests, Jane, as I say, is Dove Cottage gardener at Wordsworth Grasmere. She was awarded an MA in garden history from the University of Bristol and a PhD in environmental studies from the University of Cumbria. Prior to taking up the role at Dove Cottage in 2019, she was an independent consultant under the name of Botanical Surveys for 25 years, undertaking plant recording in historic gardens and running courses on garden history. So really the ideal credentials for being the gardener at Dove Cottage. And then Jeremy Davies is Associate Professor of English at the University of Leeds. He's currently writing a book with the title The Altered Landscape, 1793 to 1834, which links literature and philosophy to experiences of agricultural reform, land reclamation, estate management, horticulture, and industrial planning. He is the principal investigator of Experiments in Land and Society, 1793 to 1833. So welcome both. Thank you very much for joining and taking part in the webinar.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, you know, I love talking about the garden, so this is a pleasure for me.
Thanks, Jeff. It's lovely to be here and to chat with you and with Jane as well, from I've learned an awful lot about the garden over the last couple of years.
Well, nothing like as much as I've learned from you both. So thank you. So we mentioned the project, Jeremy, and this University of Leeds project, Experiment in Land, funded, am I right, by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and it has had a huge impact. And I just wonder if maybe we could begin by you saying a little about that project, what it involves, and also why you invited Wordsworth Grasmere to become a partner in it.
Sure. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, it's a project, as you suggested, about the changing environment in Britain in the early 19th century. That's an era of the enclosure or privatization of land, of what people at the time called the rise of manufactures. And so I think of it as a period of a few decades when the environment of Britain was modernized, kind of became more like it is today in quite dramatic and exciting ways. So I am writing a book, which you mentioned, called The Altered Landscape, about schemes to change the physical environment, schemes to change particular places in and around the first decade of the 19th century. And the way in which those schemes often went hand in hand with literature and philosophy. So I'm writing about an industrial village, an enormous peat bog that people tried to drain and reclaim for agriculture, an estuary that people tried to reclaim from the Irish Sea, an estate in Yorkshire that was managed in novel and interesting ways. And also, as you say, about one much smaller place that has actually had a lot more written about it than probably all of those other places put together. It seemed like it wouldn't be right to tackle this project without thinking about the Wordsworths and the way they took on this little slip of mountain ground, their garden orchard, as they sometimes called it, and changed it and planted things in it, rebuilt it, altered it, and also crucially wrote about it and imagined it and had it feed into their thinking, their taste, their judgment and ideas about literature and about the kind of society they were living in and how that society was changing. So I think that the garden orchard behind Dove Cottage, small as it is another place that can help us to think about the ways in which the environments of Britain changed around the start of the 19th century.
Well, we're very pleased you did. And as we'll see, perhaps towards the end, the project that you invited us to be part of is not just on the site, but it's also working with schools and with community groups throughout Cumbria. So we'll come back to that and see the impact it's had on there. But maybe then the next place to go is the garden itself. I wonder, Jane, if you do many tours of the garden. We often see you talking to visitors who are thoroughly engaged by what you say. I wonder if you could give us a tour of the garden. And maybe is this where we turn to PowerPoint? Would that help?
Yes, I'd just like to say as well, it's thanks to the support of Leeds University that I have been able to, with great pleasure, to acquire numerous plants for actually not only Dove Cottage Garden, but there are other gardens on the site of the Trust, including the sensory garden and what we're calling at the moment, its name might change, but Sykeside Wildlife Garden. And there are also smaller areas, the herb garden, the little wildflower garden next to the cafe, etc., that have also benefited from the support of Leeds University. So yes, if we have a tour now then. Right, so here we have a very simplified plan of the garden. First of all, it is enclosed by a wall, and the wall is controversial because we don't know who erected the wall. In a lot of books, it's cited that it was Thomas de Quincey, but I put that down and I was taken up by Jeff saying, no, we have no evidence for that. So I quickly removed that. And we're also researching, hopefully, a little bit more about it. I think the garden in total, it's difficult to assess its size because it's almost vertical gardening in some places. It's quite fashionable to have a lot of vertical planting, and we've got that because of the numerous walls. I think about a third of an acre. The majority, all of it, is, as I say, on a steep slope. You can see that there's a rocky outcrop just above number 5. But if we start at number 1, that is obviously the entrance to the front of the cottage. You can't actually use the gates now there because of the Reimagining Wordsworth project. You come through the museum and then down, have a lovely slide film show, and then you go into the cottage from there. Then you come out of the back door, and as you can see from the back door, the majority of the garden is situated. There are paths all the way round, and then if you follow it and you get up to number 7 and 8, number 7 is the top terrace. But beyond the wall today, although we have a covered seat, beyond there used to be a very, very important place for the Wordsworths called the Moss Hut. That is now in woodland. So from the top and round to that side is all woodland now. And then at the bottom, we're talking about the herb garden, and then the site from the steps going up to the where you buy tickets, etc. So as I say, it's a very enclosed garden, but it wasn't in the Wordsworth's day. It was quite open. We have yew trees, which we thought to have been planted by the Wordsworths at number 2. Number 3, a Portugal laurel. When I first came, I thought Portugal laurel, well, surely they wouldn't have had those. They're introduced, albeit they were introduced very early, 1638. But we know conclusively they were there because, bless her, so very, very useful to me is Dorothy's journal. Obviously the poetry, you know, to see what plants they knew, but the poetry from Dorothy tells you an awful lot about what was in the garden. They talk about coming back after William was married and they rushed out, and by golly, hadn't the Portugal laurel grown? So little snippets like that tell us a lot. Number 4 is a grassy bank. We're trying to encourage lots of wildflowers in this area. We don't know exactly how it was in the Wordsworth's day, but as I always say to visitors, we're trying to create it in the spirit of. There's nothing to show it, although I said Dorothy does write quite a little bit about it. There's nothing to say in her writing about the layout. We know there was a well. Dorothy talks about it being a bit muddy. We know there was a terrace, that's, as I said, number 7. That was created by Wordsworth with help from John Fisher. And that was so he would have somewhere flat, the only flat area in the whole of the garden, which he could easily walk. I think Jeff again picked me up on this. I said forwards and backwards. I said, oh, that's that. People don't walk backwards, Jeff. And you said, no, but that was how they wrote about it. So from there, you have a wonderful view, and we'll have a slide of that shortly. I will on the PowerPoint, a photograph. And as I say, because, as I say, it's not very big, but because of the walls, because it's partly shaded, because it's very sunny, it has a huge variety of habitats. And we're trying to get it so it is also wildlife friendly. And I talk about it being a little refuge, because where we say wildflowers, they are probably the ancestors of what were there originally. And we do have a lot of traditional wildflowers, you know, English wildflowers there. Little vegetable garden, nothing very significant. We don't know for sure whether they had a separate one, or was mentioned by one of the people who vlogged on, whether it was vegetables were interspersed around the garden. But today, as I say, at number 6, we just have a small one. Scots pine, we know it was his second favourite tree after the oak tree. Various steps, the most important ones being Wordsworth's, but they're currently inaccessible as they're rather uneven and dangerous. And then the steps created, we think, around about the 1920s, which takes you up to the top terrace. And as I say, from the top terrace, just wonderful views, although slightly spoilt today compared to the Wordsworth time, from having great big terraces built. And the planting I'm going to talk about later. And so I think that's just giving you the bare bones of the garden.
I guess, Jen, the thing that we don't know too, do we, is on the bottom of the screen here, for people who haven't been to Grasmere, there is now the museum. And I guess that being the coach house, say from the 1850s, we just don't know how whether the garden extended in that direction either, do we? So. Yeah.
And I should have, of course, I should have mentioned the most important thing was the orchard. And that, as I say, it says there sort of on the left, orchard thought to have been here, but because the wall was constructed, I think this must have cut the orchard in two. We do have a little note from Dorothy saying when they did come that they actually took a fence down between the garden and the orchard. But as I say, today there is no orchard, it is woodland, although we have planted some token fruit trees to give the idea, obviously, that there were some fruit trees up there.
And number 7 was the orchard pathway, wasn't it? So that suggests, doesn't it, too, that that's where it went. Shall we move to the next picture? Yeah.
Yes. So if you came out of the back door and you turned left, that is the view. Now, one visitor very kindly said to me, she says, this garden's a bit unruly. I said, yes, but it's a managed unruly. And that is a very tricky thing to do. It cannot be neat and tidy. It has got to be, as I said, in the spirit of how the Wordsworths would have had it. And wildflowers do their own thing. You can't really manipulate them too much. They are what they are. And they tend to be a little bit more unruly. But to me, that is actually quite a joy. So you can see here, as the white flowered is the Portugal laurel in flower. And that is quite magnificent. But to the left of it, you might, hopefully you can see, it's a rhododendron. And some people said, well, should that really be there? Well, technically, no. but of course it screens all the newer buildings, particularly the new museum and the lift shaft, from the garden today. So it's a question of aesthetics and what looks right. And in the opinion of most of us, I don't just base it on my opinion. I sort of ask people and ask Jeff, you know, should it stay, should it not stay? And the universal opinion is it's adding to the garden, and it's giving that lovely idea of seclusion as to how it would have been in the Wordsworth day in this part of the garden.
This lovely wildflower area in the middle here, that to my mind is one of the great benefits of the project, as it were, of the project support, that it's a lovely thing, particularly in full bloom. It's made such a...
I mean, there were some existing wildflowers, and I've only added, so for example, we had oxeye daisy, so I've put more of those in, and we had betony, and I've put more of those in. So I haven't just introduced things willy-nilly. I've very, very carefully, when I took on the role, I looked to see, I recorded first what was here, and then looked them up. It's still ongoing research. It's, you know, quite a tall order. I looked up then the dates of introduction. Were they native or were they introduced? And then it's a question, if they're later plantings, when the Wordsworth Trust took over the running of the garden, it does from their time have, or did have, quite a significant overlay of Victorian planting. And that is when that rhododendron dates from. So this one's just showing you a little bit more a close-up of the wildflowers. We have the tall spikes out on mullein, but if you can see the little white blobs, I know they won't be easily distinguishable, but that is absolutely the one I always pick out for all visitors. It's just a common daisy, but when I say just, it's not just, because it's one of the ones, and as I say, I'll be talking a little bit more about the planting as well. That is the one that Wordsworth, he wrote 4 poems to it. So I'm afraid the daffodil is, you know, knocked out of court. It's 4 to the daisy and 3 to the lesser celandine. Oh, but this is a lovely shot. We have poetry reading in the garden, and here they are suitably attired. And as I said, it's just when you see them in the garden and they're reading the poetry, it just somehow looks so wonderful and just so right. A little bit more of the planting. We're looking the other way now, so we're looking towards the back door, and again you see how the sort of, I'm trying to blend the wildflowers into some cultivated. The pinky coloured one is rose campion, and that was introduced very early in the 16th century. They weren't averse to having plants that were cultivated, provided they were sort of very old medieval in origin. A lot of ferns, again, an overlay of Victorian planting, but hopefully the wildflowers and the early cultivated, they all blend in together and give this idea of being very natural. Here's the view, but I'm not sure we've clipped off the top actually of the silver how, haven't we? I don't know where that went, but obviously it's a higgledy-piggledy bit of ruse, which is rather interesting in itself, particularly the chimney pots. And then you see the big building, which is Lake Terrace, sorry, wasn't there in their day. So they had a view straight over to literally the Grasmere, the lake. But as I say, from that height, and also from, if you go to the top of the woodland, you do get an idea of when they said just how beautiful a spot it was and why they admired it so much. Silver birch there on the right, used, you can see on the left, and again, they're the ones possibly planted by the Wordsworths. From the top terrace, as I say, a lovely view.
And it's something, isn't it, that they mention in their first letter, almost the day after they arrived. They write to Coleridge, and William says how delighted Dorothy is with this very view.
Yeah.
Do you want to say just a little bit about the other places on site, Jane, if you would?
Yes, as they're on now. This is just looking through the gate to what we still haven't positively got a name for it yet, but Sykeside Wildlife Garden, which, as I mentioned, Leeds Project is helping very much to support. It's so that you can have, we're trying to get the gardens different from each other. So very much Dove Cottage Garden is the Wordsworth garden. So very natural, you know, inspiration, nature. This wildlife garden is actually neat and tidy, not quite prim and proper, but everything in it is wildlife friendly. So, you know, you have the logo of the Royal Horticultural Society, the bee friendly logo. So every plant, well, nearly every plant, we're still being developed, has some benefit to wildlife, but it's to show Sometimes people are a little bit worried about having a wildlife garden, that it has to be very untidy and a bit messy. Well, you don't. You can actually have quite a tidy garden, provided all the planting is right. And then you do certain things to encourage wildlife to come in. Again, with the support of leaves, we're putting a little pond in, and we've got like a bird feeder, a bird table, etc. Oh, thank you. This is the sensory garden. I inherited this wonderful gunnerer. It has to be sensory, doesn't it? I mean, it's so in your face architecturally, etc. This is, most of the planting has been done this year, so it's still settling in, barring the gunnerer. How big it will grow, I don't know. Some of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with it, and it can literally take over the space. So literally watch this space. This garden, again, is slightly different because it's not obviously encouraging taste, but it's encouraging all the other aspect of the senses. Again, relating it to the Wordsworth thoughts, and obviously by in itself, you know, if you have scent and colour, etc., it will encourage wildlife again. This is next door to the old library, which is part of the Sykeside, the other garden we saw, which is at the front of this building.
That's fantastic, Jane. Fantastic. I think what we might do now then is to invite you both to comment on some old photographs and some old drawings of the, I'll just come out and then come back in again. We do in the collection have some things, not many images from the period, from the Wordsworth period, none at all really, but we do have some slightly later. And the first one is intriguing because it's from a sketchbook that was made in 1850. What's happened to my camera? Let's come back. Let's share again. Where's it gone? Let's try that. My apologies. There we go. So this is a sketchbook that was compiled after Wordsworth's death, and many of the drawings in it were made in August, the August of the year of his death. And two in particular are very relevant to this talk. So this is done, as you can maybe see, it's done on the, I think it's the 15th of August, 1850. The house was lived in by a coal merchant at the time and his family. You can notice in front, it says it's Wordsworth afterwards to Quincy's house, Town End, Grashmere. So it's still not called Dove Cottage in this drawing, at least. And there are things as again, maybe Jane and Jeremy, you maybe could comment on maybe the trees are noted, and the wall, for example, is no longer the sort of slate fence that we see in the early drawings. Is there anything in this drawing that strikes you, if I may put you on the spot?
Well, may I, Jeremy? Is that okay? Obviously, we're talking about 1850. So in terms of a garden can change in a year. So we're talking quite a long time from the period that the Wordsworths were there. And what you can see from this drawing is certain things that wouldn't perhaps have been there in their day, but have subsequently come in. For example, that very long stripy thing at the by the chimney coming down, it says poplar. Now they would come in very, very quickly. And then it says beech. So again, you know, were they remnants of what were there? I doubt it. But the ash, yes, at the back, and then it says distant fells and then firs. Possibly, you know, they were there. But what it does indicate is obviously that wall is there, and that is the one we currently have, not the one that the Wordsworths had.
So if I move to the one below, it's interesting, Jeremy, in this one, that there are the steps, that the steps that go up, as it were. Well, there seems to be Wordsworth steps, and here's the steps leading up, as it were, to what we tend to think of as Wordsworth steps. Don't know whether there's anything that strikes you. There's the wall that we talk about. So the wall was there by 1850.
And you can see they mention orchard.
Yeah.
But it must, as I said, it must have split the orchard in two, that wall.
I feel like sort of Ronald Reagan sometimes, you know, tear down this wall.
Yeah.
It's really, you know, I think one of the things about thinking about somewhere that's a real historic place is that the way that place is today can tell you an awful lot about it. but can also potentially mislead. It's so easy to imagine when you are at Dove Cottage in this wonderful place, these beautiful pictures that Jane showed us, that you're standing right there in the Wordsworth's footsteps, seeing what they saw, breathing the same air. And as you're saying, that's not quite the case. We know the garden has been a living thing that has evolved over the 2 centuries since. So there are ways in which the garden is potentially quite radically different, and ways we can't get back to the way the garden originally was. But at the same time, there's that temptation to try to shape the garden in a way that reflects the spirit of how the Wordsworths talked about it and inhabited it. And for those of you who have had the pleasure of being there, this wall that we're talking about is, I mean, it's really striking, isn't it, Jane and Jeff? It's quite sort of, it's tall and bulky and kind of impressively architectural in itself. Right?
It took a lot of work to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not just a flimsy affair.
Yeah. And in a way, it's it's impressive, and it's been there a long time. However long exactly it's been there, it's certainly been there a long time. It's kind of has a history of its own. But on the other hand, it's tempting to say, the next stage in the evolution of the garden might be to kind of open it up, to change that very enclosed character of the garden, as you say, at the moment, which in some ways I think does reflect what it was like in the Wordsworths' day. The Wordsworths do write about the garden as a secluded, enclosed, embowered, surrounded space. But at the same time, they're always going up out of it, up into the sort of woods above. There's a sense of kind of permeability between the Dove Cottage garden and the fells. It's the garden is the lowest. What's the line, Jeff? The lowest step in. The lowest step on Fairfield's mighty. Somebody's got to put it in the chat before I can look it up. Here we go. So the rocky corner in the lowest stair of that magnificent temple, which doth bound one side of our whole vale with grandeur rare. Right. So it's it's like kind of the first step on a stair, as if it invites you to venture up further into the fells. And maybe having that big wall there at the moment kind of means we lose some of that sense of the permeability of the garden to the fells around. But I don't know, it's a complicated question, a difficult one to know what to do with that wall and the other parts of the garden that we, like those rhododendrons that we know are not original to the garden as it was in the great days of Wordsworth's inhabitation, but nonetheless are kind of interesting, have a value of their own.
I mean, we have the same thing a bit with manuscripts, don't we? Where a Wordsworth manuscript might have since then had added notes, maybe by Wordsworth's grandson or maybe by others. Well, we'd never think of removing them. It's part of the history, and so too is the rhododendron. When we look on the 1850s, 1859 surveyed ordnance survey of Grasmere, there is showing a track that comes through the garden, I think up through these steps and through the wall and into the wood beyond. So whether that was some kind of thoroughfare or the two spaces were linked, but in the 1920s, the Trust bought a margin of woodland the other side of that wall. So there is a few yards, as it were, in the adjacent woodland. Should one day a decision be made to remove the wall and extend, if you like, the boundaries on a looser, system, perhaps, more open, and recreate that garden of the past. There's a nice album that we've got, a nice album of photographs, which dates from the very early 1890s, and so what are we talking, 40 years after what we just looked at, and here are those steps again. Interestingly, on that drawing, I don't know whether, can you see that perhaps?
Not yet.
Not yet, Jeff. That's coming. Yeah.
I'll just focus it. So there are the steps, and in that drawing that we looked at, I don't know if you noticed, but it said there are 37 steps, and I have counted them, and there are still 37 steps. And here is our first chairman, Stopford Brooke, the Reverend Stopford Brooke, sitting on what we were calling the Wordsworth steps, weren't we, Jane? The ones that are now perhaps too risky to walk up, but for the general visitor. But there is the garden as it looked early 1890s.
And you were saying, Jeff, what do we learn from these photographs? Well, what I've learned is that it looks nothing like that today. Obviously, I can't really show you too well because I'm doing that, but I don't know. That is what is ferns everywhere today. In front, that is where the rock is, and there's ferns in front. Can you see that or not?
Yeah.
So it's completely, you can't see those, and we're hoping actually, because Wordsworth did admire rocks, and it's quite a feature of the garden, and we're thinking to open it up a little bit more, and obviously make the steps more visible and make the rocks more visible. That area hasn't been done yet.
And if I just turn over the page, what interest there is. I don't know whether you can see that one. There's the orchard pathway as it looked sort of at 1890, and a feature that we've sometimes discussed, haven't we, Jane, is the little pond in the garden.
Yeah.
And you can see there the little pond that's fed by a pipe by the looks of it.
Yeah.
So maybe a later addition.
Well, and there's no water in it today either.
No. I think there is just one more, if I may show you, which I think looks at the back of the house. No, maybe not. Well, there's the chairman. I don't think our current chairman does this. Sit outside the back of the house with his notebook and sketchbook, and making the most from the back door of the house. But that's.
Yeah, and again, if you notice how well ferns do, I think the Lake District is renowned for its ferns, and so is the garden.
Yeah. So I'll just very quickly show you that one. There's Dove Cottage as it first looked for visitors in the very early 1890s, and you can maybe see from that there was a damp problem in that wall behind the chair, but very, very sparsely populated with artifacts, as you can see. So just to return to the garden, I wonder if I could invite each of you to say what you think is special about it. What you might say, what's its characteristics that mark it as unique, what's its character, if you like, that marks it unique. I wonder, Jeremy, if I could invite you to go first, maybe, to say what marks it out for you as this very special place.
Sure, I guess there are two ways of thinking about what makes it special, Jeff. On the one hand, you can think of it as the spiritual home of British Romantic poetry, and you can see again from Jane's pictures what a beautiful place it is, and the way that it's been written about in Dorothy's journals, in lots of poems that were composed, that Wordsworth composed poems in the garden, about the garden. He wrote and revised his work there. He read aloud. He talked to his friends, to Coleridge and others. So it's, on the one hand, it's easy to imagine, and I think kind of justified to imagine that garden as a kind of unique site for poetry, and in particular, a kind of unparalleled site sort of anywhere for the relationship between English literature and place, to the extent that you think it's healthy for poetry to be in contact with the earth, in contact with real specific places. And there's a long, long history, of course, in the history of English literature of thinking that a connection with place is vitalizing and vivifying and important to poetry. The Dove Cottage garden can seem like a sort of paragon of that, an essence of that connection between poetry and place. And I guess the other side of the coin is, the other way I think about what makes the Dove Cottage garden special is that it's been made special over the years by people mythologizing it. And this is not to say that's in any way a kind of a fake or wrong, but Dove Cottage garden, or Dove Cottage, came to be seen as a place of literary pilgrimage, really from kind of after Wordsworth's death, almost the sort of second half of the 19th century, kind of the 1850s. This is something Seiko Yoshikawa has written about very brilliantly. Rydal Mount, where the Wordsworths lived in the last decades of their life, was originally seen as the kind of Wordsworth spiritual home. And there are all sorts of, a whole range of reasons have meant over the years that Dove Cottage has taken on the sort of aura that it possesses today. Going back to Matthew Arnold, for instance, saying that actually the Wordsworth's greatest poetry was that he wrote during his years at Dove Cottage. Going back to those pictures you were showing us of the 19th century custodians and caretakers of Dove Cottage, of whom the Wordsworth Trust of today is an inheritor, and going back to the ways in which literary critics over the years have written about Dove Cottage as somewhere creative and vivifying and important for poetry. So I guess those are the two ways to see Dove Cottage on one as special. On the one hand, that connection it has to Wordsworth himself, to Wordsworth's own kind of footsteps and voice, the orchard pathway where he would go back and forth weaving his verses as he wrote. And on the other hand, the ways in which Dove Cottage has been made special over the last century and a half or so. Should I say maybe something a little more, Jeff, about that other part of your question about the character of the garden? It's something that different critics and writers have interpreted in very different ways, I think. One thing that really comes up again and again is the idea of the garden as an Eden or a paradise. That's a real theme that runs through a lot of different writing on the garden. Lucy Newlin recently has given that an interesting twist, thinking about the garden as a kind of paradise shadowed by a fall, not necessarily the kind of Eve, Eden before the apple was eaten, but a paradise that sort of has an awareness of death and vulnerability. It was really, it went to rack and ruin in 1805 after the Wordsworths got the news of John Wordsworth's death. They couldn't bear to go up in the garden. And forever after that, I think the garden was marked by this sort of tangled ruins that grew up when the family were in mourning and unable to care for it. I think that's always been part of, well, for a long time, been part of the character of the garden. Russell Noyes had a sort of classic account of the garden as a place that achieves a harmony between art and nature. And you can see that's a kind of classic way of thinking about the garden, as a harmony between art and nature. But Peter Dale, who someone mentioned in the chat at the start, actually, has a really interesting account saying that actually the Dove Cottage garden is not quite like that. He thinks that the Dove Cottage garden was more a sort of anthology of different parts that didn't really come together, and Wordsworth became a better gardener and succeeded in creating fully integrated gardens only later at Cole Autumn and at Rydal. So again, there are kind of different ways of reading it. Jessica Fay, I see, is here with us. She's written very brilliantly about how the garden was influenced by Quaker ideals and practices. Kurt Heinzelman's written about it as a site of Georgic labour, so of kind of farming and productive labour. And Jacqueline Labb similarly has seen it as a kind of subsistence garden. So Jane can talk more about this than me perhaps, but the Wordsworths grew a lot of fruit and veg there. And Jacqueline Labb has been a critic to really emphasize the idea that it was like a kind of working garden, a garden that provided important food resources for the Wordsworths when they were sort of relatively hard up for part of their time, or for a considerable amount of their time at Dove Cottage. Just to give my own sort of take on it, I suppose, we've already kind of touched on this, but I guess I see the garden in some ways a little differently to how it's been written about by previous critics. What really strikes me looking at the Wordsworth's writings is that sense of the garden as actually a kind of sleepy and easeful place. Those critics who describe it as a place of labour and hard work and digging and vegetables and production, there's something to that. But for me, the most characteristic feature of the garden as the Wordsworths describe it is that it's a place of ease and sleep and soporific calm. And that has to do with the way they describe it as being characteristically kind of leafy, shady, overgrown, woody, enclosed. Dorothy writes in her poems about the garden as being surrounded by tufts of trees. That sense of it as a kind of embowered, umbrageous, nest-like sort of place seems really striking to me. A place where the plants grow very vigorously. There's a lot of emphasis on the kind of bounty and the fertility of the garden, but where they don't tend to do so on the Wordsworth's account in ways that are overwhelming. William in particular wrote a lot about cottage gardens in his poetry and often describes cottage gardens as being at acute threat of being kind of overrun by weeds and tangle and mess. So for those who know the poem, The Ruined Cottage is a great example of that, but it comes into the female vagrant and hermit grasmere and the excursion and tufted primroses as well. Very often in Wordsworth's poetry, gardens that you don't look after tend to fall to bits or get kind of ruined really quickly. And what's interesting about the Dove Cottage garden for me, as the Wordsworths imagine it, is that it's not like that. It's a place where you don't have to work too hard, where things will grow, but kind of softly and gently and commodiously and in harmony with human life. That's what seems to me really distinctive about the garden as the Wordsworths imagine it.
I mean, as you're talking, the last stanza of A Farewell comes to mind, and maybe you're going to read that later on, but it would be nice to hear that, because that beautifully sums up that point you're making between industry and slumber, as he said. Do you have it to hand?
I think I do. I'm not seeing a, oh, there's my share screen button. So, yeah, how's that?
There we go. That's the one. Yeah.
Shall I read it?
Please do. I'd love to hear it. Yeah.
Oh, happy garden, loved for hours of sleep, a quiet garden, loved for waking hours, for soft half slumbers that did gently steep our spirits, carrying with them dreams of flowers, beloved for days of rest in fruit tree bowers. 2 burning months let summer overleap, and coming back with her who will be ours, into thy bosom we again shall creep. Wordsworth, at the time he writes this poem, is about to go away for the summer and come back married to Mary, and he writes a poem to the garden, the poem on going for Mary, as they refer to it sometimes, to the garden that he'll come back to, saying, don't run too wild while we're away. You'll miss us, but don't be resentful that we're gone. He imagines the garden as something that might kind of resent the absence of its gardeners, but that can be mollified and pacified and can be available when they return as a place to relax in, to sleep together. His new life with his wife will, and still with Dorothy, who's still living with them, will be a time he hopes of kind of tranquility and peace made possible by this garden.
We may come back in more detail to this one, but the version I have in the 1815 is interesting. O happy garden, whose seclusion deep hath been so friendly to industrious hours and to soft slumbers that did gently steep. So that combination of the industry and the slumbers coming, really direct, isn't it, in that other version of the poem?
So fascinating. This first version of the poem, the garden seems like an incitement to laziness, I suppose you could say. And in retrospect, Wordsworth did seem to have thought that. He seemed to have felt that this ending of the poem made the garden too much purely a place of sleep and rest and lazy slumber. And he revised this stanza dramatically to make it an encouragement to industry, a place where you might go and sort of rest to get your strength back before you get back to work. That's a fascinatingly different vision of the garden, I think. And
work being the labouring and work being the composition in this instance, isn't it? Jane, maybe come to you. If you could tell us what, your sense of its uniqueness and specialness.
Well, from my point of view, obviously, as garden historian background, it's comparing it to what was going on in the period, for garden design. So we'd had the very, very formal gardens of the 17th century. Then we'd got on, gradual change and Arcadian gardens. And then we got the Lancelot Brown gardens, neither of which Wordsworth approved of. And then we have Humphrey Repton, who was poked fun at a little bit by Jane Austen in Mansfield Park when she said, you have to go around this way, that way, see this, see that, and make sure you don't miss anything. And then talking about how these naughty people are chopping down all these beautiful avenues of trees to make way for what? Well, something that's not very much better. So really, it's, as I said, there's about 160 plants that the Wordsworths mention in their writings. And as I mentioned before, we're trying to put quite a few, if not all of them, back into the garden. And so what was going on? What were they choosing? What types of plants were they choosing? And what was their reasoning behind it? Well, it was much the same as their reasoning behind what the design of gardens should be. And obviously, the famous thing I always say to visitors is, he said, the rule is simple, Jane. I always put Jane in because I think he's always telling me the rule is simple. Work where you can in the spirit of nature with an invisible hand of art. And then that was in his guidebook. And then he wrote to Sir George Beaumont, his good friend, let nature be all in all. And I think, to me, that's my mantra for the garden, that they were being inspired by nature. They weren't being inspired by the fashionable gardens of the day or the fashionable plants. And what's also interesting at that time, there was, as I say, a fashion in plants. The choice of plants reflected your social status. So if you went and chose something like pinks or various simple sort of cottagey garden flowers, you were thought very unsophisticated. So if you wanted to be thought of, you know, gardening in the height of fashion, you didn't choose those. You chose dahlias, you choose clematis, you choose the things that nurseries are, just like today, you know, they want you to buy them. So they're bringing out newer, the bigger, more colourful, you know, double flowered, etc. They weren't interested in those at all. They were interested in simple flowers and in particular wildflowers. And we know from her journals, Dorothy went frequently into the fells and round the lake and dug up things such as orchids, tut tut, we wouldn't allow that today, and columbines and things, and brought them back. And she obviously was very interested in wildflowers from also, you know, being an amateur botanist. And I don't know if you want to show at this point, Jeff, the books that we have.
Yeah, sure.
As a botanist, you know, you like to have a book that's readily you can take out with you. Well, Dorothy stated, she said, oh, I wish I had a book on botany. And she finally got one. She got one by William Withering, who is a very eminent person of his day, a geologist, a physician, and he studied the properties of digitalis, the first person to do that. It's interesting how botanists changed from being really herbalists. The first botanists were herbalists, and then herbalism really fell out with physicians. You know, they thought it was really beneath their dignity. And then physicians became botanists, and William Withering was a physician. And if we, as I say, look, turn a few pages, Jeff, and you will see that there is absolutely, there is the page for the Speedwell, and bless it, somebody, goodness knows what the age is, there's a little press specimen there. I have to add, this is not the edition of the Wordsworths, but my own, for ease of looking at it. There is, if you look towards, I'm not sure, Jeff, can you lift it up a bit? Lift the book up a bit. No, up higher. All right. Yeah, there. Can you see at the bottom, it says, it's Veronica, and it's in Latin, Veronica Comedris, and that is Jemanda Speedwell. And Dorothy wrote in her journal a beautiful line about the Speedwell being a beautiful blue color, just like jewelry or the blue glass. And this one, as I say, to try and find this, to identify this species, you don't have any pictures and you don't have any keys, which are like 2 questions you ask to try and finally get to the right plant. What at this period they had to do, and it was called after Linnaeus, it was called his lewd system, because you had to look at the male and the female parts of a flower. And depending on how many they had, in this instance, they had 3 male stamens and 1 stigma. And that was thought scandalous at this time, because you were having 3 males lying together with 1 female. Shock horror. And it was shock horror, so much to the extent that Withering glossed over the reproductive parts of the flower, and they didn't really come in until quite a number of years later, mainly to save the blushes of female readers. At this time, botany and painting flowers was considered a very, very good occupation for genteel ladies. So anyway, so poor Dorothy, I do sympathize with her. Even when she got the book, what a job it would be to identify anything. And then Jeff, if you'd kindly turn to the Baxter, which was sort of about 30, 40 years later. And we've got actually now the first time we start to have illustrations. We've got it a little bit, yeah. Can you lower it? Can you see again? It's Veronica Comedris. They call it wild Jemanda. We call it Jemanda Speedwell today. So finally, you've got starting to get into books, and many books on botany, floras are beginning to be published, which didn't happen before the 1800s. Well, 1750s, that many. So you can see immediately how much more helpful it would be, even if you just thumbed through every page to come to the right plant. But Jeff, if we can go to the modern flora, that I should say, they're not field floras. You can't take them with you. There's 5 volumes of that and 4 volumes of the Withering. So the adage today is you take the book to the plant, or people take their phones now, don't they? But in those days, like Dorothy did, she picked things and brought them back to the book, which of course is not acceptable today. So look at this little book. All we have to do, we don't have to look at the male parts or the female parts. We don't have to pull the flowers apart or anything like that. We literally go to this front key and you say, how many petals has it got? What color is it? Lo and behold, it says Speedwell's page 224. And Jeff, if you'd like to go to 224, thank you very much. Now, wouldn't Dorothy have loved to have had a book like this? So we go down a little bit where Jeff, so really botanists today, we have no excuse at all for not being reasonably competent, but my sympathies go out to Dorothy. To be a botanist there, you really had to, you know, study hard. Wordsworth, in fact, later said, though, he really relied on Dorothy for her botanical knowledge and what a good botanist she was. And he said, my interest is more of a poetical kind. And I relied on my sister, you know, if I wanted to know anything. But he still included, as I say, you know, a good number between them, 160 different wildflowers and a few cultivated, but not many. And their interest was not in writing about cultivated plants. You know, they didn't write about the big blousy rose. As I said, they wrote about the daisy or the lesser celandines and plants like that. They were of interest. And that, to be planting wildflowers in a day when so many plants were coming in from abroad, being, you know, discovered or being bred, the growth in nurseries breeding plants was phenomenal at this time. We had one locally, but there was also great big ones in Yorkshire. So, you know, they were trying to get you to buy all these plants. You know, why would they promote wildflowers? Well, they wouldn't. So they were going very much against the grain of the time, and quite radical for the time, really.
And in the poem that Jeremy has mentioned once or twice, Farewell, it is explicit, isn't it, that they bring the flowers in from the fells and
yes,
and just
it wasn't just flowers. Dorothy, the ferns, Wordsworth wrote about, and of course, as I mentioned, the Lake District is renowned for its ferns, but also moss. She loved moss. She talks about, like, you don't need flowers in a little poem she wrote. You know, the colours are just exquisite in a moss, and when you look at the detail of moss, and she often in winter brought moss in and put it on the mantelpiece, and really appreciated, and they appreciated the little commonplace things. And I think the commonplace was very important to them, and in some ways it reflected, you know, he wasn't interested in a nobleman or anybody else. He was interested in the common man, and just like that, he wrote about, you know, people who didn't have money, didn't have wealth, and he wrote about the commonplace wildflowers. They were not big and blousy like all these exotics being introduced.
I'm gonna, in thinking about our webinar, we've talked about a number of things and we've listed a number of things we could talk about. And I realize that there's many more things that we could talk about. And we'd like to introduce the questions from the audience at 1:45. I wonder if I could just invite you, maybe, you know, 5, 6, 7 minutes each, to sort of think which of the topics that we've discussed that you'd like to talk about in the time that we've got left. Just so that we don't miss anything important, as it were. So whether it could be Dorothy's journals you might like to talk about, or the social aspects of the garden, or maybe the poems that came out of the garden, which if I could invite each of you to choose a topic maybe that you'd just like to focus on. Jeremy, maybe I can invite you to go first, if that's not too unfair.
Yeah, sure. I don't have a particular thing I want to cover, Jeff, but I have some slides with some texts on them, and perhaps should we
Let's
just
do that. Let's do that. That would be great.
Okay. Yeah. How about a Dorothy poem or a William poem? Which do you prefer? I'll share my screen. I'll show you what I've got to hand. Should we talk about?
I'm going to.
Butterflies quite good, because it says about my trees, they are my sister's flowers, and that's why I would like to pick up on that. But it's up to you, Jeff, whatever you think.
Well, I quite like that Dorothy poem.
Yeah.
You've got to remember we've got 48 people watching, so we mustn't be too selfish. But I like that. I like that Dorothy poem. If you wouldn't mind talking about that one.
We have a divide. Jane has picked out the most troubling line into a butterfly anyway. My trees, they are my sister's flowers. It says something that we don't really get elsewhere about how the garden seems to be partitioned on gender terms. The trees for the man, the flowers for the woman, which is, I think, one of the less welcome moments in the way that the Wordsworths.
I don't think in practice it was, though, Jeremy.
I don't think it was. No.
But why he says it, like you say, was gardening a man, the trees, the man's thing, and the flowers. And in some respects, later on, they certainly were. Flowers were the lady's domain, and parkland and trees were the man's domain. So it may be the beginning of that. I don't think it necessarily was at that period, but certainly it began to be.
Yeah. But this is a poem called A Sketch, and it is just it's almost a kind of offcut really from another poem, Remained in Manuscripts. It might seem kind of quite slight or casual, but it's an interesting poem, I think. So by Dorothy Wordsworth, and just a sketch. There is one cottage in our dale, in naught distinguished from the rest, save by a tuft of flourishing trees, the shelter of that little nest. The public road through Grasmere Vale winds close beside that cottage small, and there 'tis hidden by the trees that overhang the cottage wall. You lose it there, its serpent line is lost in that close household grove. A moment lost, and then it mounts the craggy hills above. I guess that's the first time I've ever read this out loud, actually, and I suppose the thing that struck me for the first time reading it is how much it stops being a poem about the cottage. That first line, there is one cottage in our dale. This is going to be a poem about this cottage. It's going to specifically pick out this cottage and tell you about it, the cottage at Town End, their cottage. But then it becomes a poem about the public road, which sounds as if it, is introduced in that fifth line, as if it might just be mentioned in passing. Oh, this is road. We're not interested in the road. As if the poem might come back to talking about the private cottage, the privacy of this little nest. But actually, the poem sort of follows the road, I suppose, doesn't it? You lose the road for a moment amid the trees of the orchard wall, and then it snakes in a serpentine way, in an elegant winding way up the craggy hills. I suppose in a way it speaks to that sense of permeability that we were talking about before, right? That the road sort of dips into the cottage, comes into contact with the cottage. It could drop people off, drop friends and neighbours off, or provide a route out for the inhabitants of the cottage, out from their garden into the world, and then climbs up into the hills. The serpent line mounts the hills.
Is this a clue to whether that wall behind Dove Cottage existed then or not?
Yeah. It is. Yeah, it's that spirit of a congruence between the public and the private, I suppose, because the cottage is there as well. It's not distinguished from what's around. It's just like all the other cottages, save for a tuft of flourishing trees, the shelter of that little nest. That word nest that often seems to be kind of on the verge of appearing in poems about the garden. The Wordsworths, William at one point said, when you mentioned that 3 children were born to him and Mary at Dove Cottage, and the cottage is far too small for that. I mean, it's ridiculous to try to raise 3 children there. Must have been absolutely impossible. So they were very glad to move out when they could. And in a letter, William says that our little cottage, our little nest is crammed edge full. So the cottage becomes a kind of overflowing nest, and increasingly over the years their life did spill out by necessity from inside the walls of the cottage into the garden. The garden became an essential place to socialise and drink tea, and also for William to work outside the kind of noise and the smoke of the cottage. So the garden and the cottage are both there as both part of this sort of nest-like, sheltered, enclosed. There's spaces of nidification, of nest building, but at the same time there's a connection to that picturesque serpentine line of the road winding up into the hills.
There's a lovely moment, isn't there, where I think it's young Johnny, their very young son, sort of works his way up the new steps that William and John Fisher have put in. It's those lovely family moments that come through in their letters. Sorry.
They talk kind of strenuously going up the steps, don't they?
They do.
Involved in kind of inhabiting this steep garden. I think that's what gives the garden an important part of its character, that sense of a rising altitude.
And they always talk about going up into the orchard, don't they? As you say, it's taking a cloak into the orchard and sitting and reading and the evening air taking up there.
It's both and also sort of away, because you have that elevation. It's right there, you just step out your front door and you're there, but also it's kind of set apart, a place where you might go up and it becomes a space of meditation, contemplation of views to distant horizons, to Silver Howe.
Yeah. Jane, may I invite you to talk on something? You would like to talk about the Daisy poem, I know.
You know me very well, Jeff.
Let's talk about the Daisy poem, and whether that is one of the Daisy poems that might, refer to what Jeremy was saying about John Wordsworth.
No, well, this one doesn't actually. It refers back. I haven't really mentioned both William and Dorothy, their observational skills of plants. And to me, to the same flower, the daisy, this one was the 1802 one. And if I'll just read the first and a couple, not all of it, because obviously with time's pressing, but it's about the commonplace again. And this is just why I love it. It says, with little here to do or see of things that in the great world be. Daisy, again I talk to thee, for thou art worthy, thou unassuming commonplace of nature, with that homely face, and yet with something of a grace which love makes for thee. And then the bit that is sort of observant, and this is what I always show visitors in the garden. I always pick up one little daisy. We've got lots of daisies, and this is why. A little cyclops with one eye, staring to threaten and defy. He's basically describing the plant, isn't he? Little cyclops, it's actually made up of lots and lots of teeny tiny flowers, is the daisy, not just one. So a little cyclops with one eye. But the other line, he says, a queen with crown of rubies dressed. And I thought, well, what's he talking about there? And then if you pick a daisy, when it's closed up, in rain or in the evening or in the morning, it looks like a little crown and it's tipped with red. So a queen with crown of rubies dress. I thought, blow me down. I am looking at exactly what he is describing. And I show the visitors and they all go away. They all, if they don't remember anything, they remember that daisy poem. And then he then says in the last stanza, he says, bright flower, for by that name at last, when all my reveries are past, I call thee and to cleave fast, sweet silent creature, that breathes with me in sun and air. Do thou as thou art wont repair my heart with gladness and a share of thy meek nature. And I just love that. And when you look at, and I think, we've all been told, haven't we, nature, it's making us feel better for your mental health. Well, when you read that and you look at the daisy, I think, well, yeah.
Wonderful. Eric Lindstrom asks a question, Jane, about plants, and asks, are snowdrops just ubiquitous in the lakes, or would Wordsworth grow them on purpose? And did the Wordsworth have any daffodils at Dove Cottage? Or were those all volunteers out by the lakes, as in the famous journal entry near Ewsmere? So daffodils and snowdrops. And maybe I could ask you about bluebells as well, because we often get that question, don't we, whether bluebells are mentioned in the journals.
Snowdrops are a tricky one. Botanists don't agree as to whether they're native or not. So we don't really know. They're possibly native in the south of England, possibly not native up here, a bit like beech. So the jury's out on that one. So they could be or they couldn't be native. Whether they're up here and they were planted or whether they got here by stealth by their own, a lot of plants spread by themselves gradually. It takes a while. Some people might be familiar with ivy leaf toadflax, the little creeping thing in walls. That was introduced in the 17th century as a rockery plant, and it's everywhere now. So a bit like snowdrops, given time, something like that, a bulbous plant can spread. Daffodils, we don't have any concrete knowledge of daffodils being in the garden. All we know is where they saw them and where they had the inspiration from the poem. There's no information in her journal saying I planted daffodils or anything as simple as that, or I planted snowdrops, or I saw snowdrops in the garden. So bluebells.
Bluebells, yeah.
Bluebells are easier. They are definitely native, and they are very, very ubiquitous in all, traditional ancient woodland. They can be planted now in quite, unfortunately, they hybridize with, some people will know, the Spanish bluebell, and they hybridize with that, and we have severe problems, trying to keep our English bluebells pure, as it were. So we have three possible contenders for bluebells: the English bluebell, the Spanish bluebell, which is in a lot of gardens, and I hate to say it, is in Dove Cottage garden where it's been taken out, and the hybrid.
And she doesn't, Dorothy wouldn't call them bluebells, does she? Or
no, they're blue hyacinths.
Blue hyacinths.
She does mention them, but again, not specifically as she planted them or in the garden.
And then Vivian Ripley has asked the question, do you think the ferns are more a Victorian introduction rather than bringing ferns into the garden from the fowls?
We've got a mixture of both.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got, as I mentioned, this Victorian overlay in the garden. At the height of sort of when they were redoing the garden, the Wordsworth Trust, there was a Victorian fern craze. And I don't know if any of you eat custard creams, but if you look at the pattern on the front, guess what it is? It's a fern. So next time you eat a custard cream, it's a fern. So yes, we have ostrich fern and we have sensitive fern in the garden. Sensitive fern is a bit like bracken, and it creeps under the ground and pops up, creeps under the ground and pops up. We can't eradicate it, it's impossible. We have got ostrich fern, and that photograph I showed you after Jeff showed you the historic photograph of the steps and the worthies sitting by the rocks, they are ostrich fern, and they're a Victorian planting, sort of mid 1840s, something like that, introduced. And I quiz visitors, shall we keep them or shan't we keep them? Oh, keep them, they're part of the history of the garden. And it's, as I say, it's like, well, do you or don't you? So we're having a compromise and taking some of them out. Oh, we have a lot of, sorry, just finally, we have a lot of beautiful native ferns. Sadly, with the dry weather, we have a lot of polypody, some of you might know, on the walls with beautiful mosses, but they keep dying off because of the dry weather. They keep coming back, and of course they're happy now, and I'm happy because they're all lovely and green again.
This is a sort of a biggish question, which I'll ask Jeremy maybe to take first, and maybe Jane too, about Youthedale Price and Payne Knight. Is there what might their influences have been on William and Dorothy?
It's a difficult question, and a really interesting one. I'd be very interested to hear Jane's answer. The first thing to say is that the Wordsworths were very aware of contemporary horticultural thought. Youthedale Price in particular, William read him, knew him, was interested in Price's work. So you'd think that in some ways the Wordsworths might be kind of in touch with the cutting edge of garden design. William, I should say, said himself that if he hadn't been a poet, he could have been a landscape gardener. Those were the professions for which he was suited by temperament. And yet, as Jane has been saying, and I completely agree with her about this, the Dove Cottage garden seems to have been a very unfashionable one, uninterested in hothouse plants and espaliered trees and those kind of most kind of modern kinds of horticultural innovation, and fairly uninterested in exotic plants, but also hard to fit into any kind of picturesque box either. When Wordsworth had the William had the opportunity to design a garden on a larger scale while the family were living at Dove Cottage at Cole Orton, the Wordsworths were invited to go and stay at their friends, the Beaumont's house, for William to oversee the design of a winter garden there. William looked back further in time to Joseph Addison's essay on garden design of the early 18th century, and that's what informed his account of Coleorton as a secluded, cloistral sort of space, a deliberately, a self-consciously old-fashioned kind of garden. So I think the both Wordsworth's relation to contemporary gardening fashion, to figures like Eugene Price and Payne Knight, is a really interestingly vexed one. Jane, what do you think?
Well, I agree with you. I mean, Dorothy says she read Mr. Knight's landscape one morning, full stop. Well, yes, Dorothy, and, you know, why couldn't she have said what she thought about it? And then William visited, was it Foxdale he visited? And, you know, well, okay, well, what did you discuss? And what was the outcome? They are completely silent on it. What they're not quite so silent on is William Gilpin. As I say, William's not quite so silent on. We do have various comments about, you know, the landscape, you shouldn't have white buildings in it, etc. And I think perhaps they paid a little bit more attention to that than they did to, it was very much a theoretical idea, this, you know, the picturesque and the beautiful and the sublime. And whilst I might have read about it, I don't know that it influenced one way or the other. I think it was still that, you know, their inspiration was nature and the wildflowers, and what was, like Dorothy was forever going out on the fells and collecting things. And as I say, William wrote about, you know, a lot of the animals and the plants that he saw.
Which brings us back to that one of our earlier questions about its uniqueness. It's just inspired by nature. And there was a question from us. There's a couple of questions, Jane, if I may just maybe to end up with. One is the principles that you follow, and I'm guessing they're the principles that you quoted earlier on. Let nature be all in all.
Yes.
Yeah.
As I said, when visitors come in, that is a question, you know, I'm commonly asked, well, how do you know what you're doing? Well, first of all, first of all, as I said, when I first started the role as gardener, it had been left the garden since it was end of May, and it had been left since before Christmas. So it was a question of finding out, well, what's in the garden, recording all the plants, and then researching, because I have to admit, I didn't know an awful lot about the Wordsworth's philosophy on gardens. So yes, so it was really then, after, you know, researching their philosophy, and after looking at what plants, what dates of introduction, or are they native or whatever, and what do we keep and what's in the spirit of. So it's taking in the history, the philosophy, and obviously what does well now, you know, what was survived, because certain things, as I say, are struggling, and maybe what the things they grew. I mean, what is lovely is Dorothy says the roses are all bashed and the things have been eaten. I thought, well, that's it, nothing's ever changed, has it, in gardening?
They don't mention slugs by name, do they?
They don't mention slugs.
I think they talk about mice, but I don't think they talk about slugs.
They say how something's eaten all the scallop beans, and then the roses have been, you know, fretted, and oh dear me. You think, oh well, you know, that's life, isn't it, as a gardener?
It is. Frederick, if I read this right, Alberton Johnson has asked the question about whether you have sort of influenced, as it were, by the work of Sally Beamish at the Brantwood Garden. Don't know whether you.
It's me?
Yeah.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
No,
No.
it's a totally different philosophy in that garden. Ruskin was very much looking for social improvement, and he was looking at a garden that, you know, somebody with a very, very small plot of land could have, that could grow vegetables and fruit and almost be self-sustaining. The Wordsworths, you know, I know, you know, they weren't wealthy or anything, but they were by no means lacking in, you know, food. And as Jeremy said, you know, they grew their own vegetables, etc. But they had a glut of peas. I mean, it's forever. They were forever picking peas and giving them to the neighbours. And of course, in those days, you know, you didn't buy things, you swapped. Oh, I've got a whole load of peas, can I have some of your beans? But as I say, Ruskin's philosophy was very much trying to find the way that, you know, people with little means or little money or little land could provide themselves with food.
And the neighbours
yeah.
And that community of Townend and the Ashburners and the Fishers and the Wordsworths seem to be helping each other out there, don't they? And swapping food
neighbours,
with.
I mean, you know, very neighbourly. I mean, you know, took beans to Mrs. Simpson or vice versa. And I mean, that's how things were then, you know. You didn't buy things, you just swapped.
Somebody asked about the questions you get in the garden, Jane. What might be a typical one? What might be a favourite one?
It's the one I've already quoted. The lady saying it's a very unruly garden. Yes, but it's a managed unruly, and it's jolly hot. It's basically what plants are, what is left from the words. Is this, no, the common one is this like how the Wordsworths had it? And then I sort of think, oh, how much do I have to tell them? No, it isn't. Not really. It's in the spirit of. And as Jeremy said about the walls and things, it does totally alter, you know, the feel of a garden. That maybe if the woodland was quite, you know, dense, it would still have that sort of secluded feeling, irrespective of the wall. But I still think, whatever, that garden somehow, and everybody who comes into it, they seem just to be amazed by it, whether it has a certain atmosphere or because it is enclosed or because the way it slopes up, they just say, oh, it's just beautiful in here. And I'm busy thinking, oh, that needs doing, this needs doing, I haven't cut this and that and the other. And no, the visitors just love it.
And particularly so, I know we've got, I haven't seen everybody's name tonight, but we've got Jane, who's one of the costume poetry readers, and to be in the garden and to hear William and Dorothy's words read out loud beautifully, as those readers do, it's like a magical experience. I ought to say, just to encourage visitors, it is a beautiful place to come, but also you will see Wordsworth's own copy of Withering, William and Dorothy's copy of Withering, in the museum if you do visit. I wonder if we might just finally, just before we close, we've just got a couple of minutes, if we just swap out to, if I can find it, my PowerPoint again. Let's have a look here. So I hope you can see that on the screen. Just because we should, if we can get this to move, maybe we can't. I think it may. No, there we go. So this is all part of the sensory garden that Jane was talking about before. And here, there's the bee bowl. Just to show you this, because this is a beautiful structure made by Charlie Winnie in a project with Rob and Harriet Fraser. And one of the main features of the garden, which came, I think it was about 1805, I think, wasn't it, when it was built, was a moss hut in the Wordsworth's garden. And it was something that they'd seen on their tour of Scotland. It was almost like an upturned wren's nest, is how they describe it, layered with moss, and a place where they would socialise, where they would read, where they would write, and it was at the top of the garden. And that space seems to have been dissected by the wall, we think now, but we created our own as part of reimagining Wordsworth. And so here is a 21st century moss hut that you can see in the sensory garden, just over the road from Dove Cottage. This is Molly Fisher's garden, we might say, and there you can come and sit, and it's a wonderful place to sit, peaceful place to sit.
Jeff, can I very, very quickly read you what Dorothy said about it to Lady Beaumont?
Please do, please do.
It says, I write to you from the hut, where we pass all our time except when we are walking. It has been a rainy morning, but we are here sheltered and warm. And in truth, I think it is the sweetest place on earth. The little wrens often alight on the thatch and sing their low song. But this morning, all the birds are rejoicing after the rain. Before my eyes is the church and a few houses among the trees, and still beyond the hollow of Easdale, which I imagine but cannot see, and the quiet mountains shutting all up.
Wonderful, just wonderful. So here we have it in the Fisher's garden, and there's the bank barn that you can see, which became our first museum that you can see just behind the tree there. And there we go, looking up towards the site. All the impact, the variegated hedge along here that Jane's been able to plant as part of our recent project. So I just want to show four more slides, and then we'll close. The first of all is to show, these are to show the other work that's been part of the project that we keep referring to. This is in the sensory garden, and this is Grasmere School Gardening Club meeting on site, as you can see, to talk about the garden and to do some planting. The second one is Bonus on Solway. So this is a school in the north of the county, and here they are. This is part of their outdoor area and garden. They're creating a garden inspired by the Wordsworths on the north coast of Cumbria. And this again too. So this is Poetry and Paint at Kirkstyle community centre in Dean, inspired by William and Dorothy's writing and their garden. Sorry, that's that one. I beg your pardon. I wasn't looking at the screen as I was reading. So that's that one. That's the Poetry and Paint at Kirkstyle Community Centre. And this may lead to an exhibition in the museum early next year, we think. And then finally, I am looking at the screen this time, Wigtown Willow Building. So this is an outdoor space, again, in a town in the north of the county. And this is a willow made moss hut, if you like, the same structure, the same idea. And this has been created by West Cumbria carers. So these are different communities, at least 3 or 4 different communities that are coming to know the Wordsworths, coming to know their garden through this project. And that maybe is the place to end. Just before we do, I just want to mention, if I may, that our next exhibition, which starts in early September, is on the rewriting of the lyrical ballads by homeless people in Britain. And this will be an exhibition in which homeless people living in Manchester, in Liverpool, in Lancaster, in Kendal, together they've taken the 23 poems from that first edition, which, as you probably know, are about people living on the margins of society, and they have written them for the 21st century. So their voice, their words will be on the walls of the Wordsworth Museum from, I think, it is the 10th of September, but Hannah will correct me if I'm wrong. On the 8th of September, we have another webinar in which you will hear the original lyrical ballads. You will hear them being introduced by Professor Fiona Stafford of Oxford University, and you will then hear the project of the rewriting through the words of Phil Davenport and Julia Grime, and perhaps have readers from the project reading their work. So it's an important moment, we think. Perhaps one of the most radical exhibitions we've done and projects that we've been delighted to be part of. And so I very much hope that on the 8th of September, you can come and join us for that evening too. Now, to end, I just want to thank Jane. I want to thank Jeremy for an absolutely fascinating evening. I've been myself totally engrossed in what they've been saying. I hope you have enjoyed it as well. Thank you, Jane, for the impact you've made to the site, as well as what you've done, talked about this evening. And thank you, Jeremy, for the new insights and for the support that we keep talking about. It has made a real difference, as I hope you can see that it's made. So thank you both. And at this point, I think we'll just, unless you have anything you wish to add, we shall just say good night and wish everybody a good evening, and hope to see you on the 8th of September. Thank you, everybody. Bye night. Bye.
Thanks for coming.